So in this lesson, we're going to learn actually how to create animation using a object, which will be a motion tween, and we're actually going to create a ball animation across the stage. So just like before, we're going to basically click ActionScript 3.0 and create a new scene setup here. So first, what we want to do is actually want to create a background environment for our actual animation. So in order to do that, what I'll do is I'll go down here and I'll create a fill color. And I'm just going to create a random brown. I'm going to add a stroke, such as black. And I'm going to use a rectangle. And I'm going to click and drag across the bottom part of my stage here. And I'm actually going to create this rectangle where it's outside the stage dimensions. And just release the click. Now I had object drawing turned on, which allowed me to go ahead and create this shape with the bounding box. I'm going to go ahead and use the selection tool, deselect, and using the same concept, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create another rectangle, change its color to a light blue. Sounds pretty good. And I'll click and drag across the stage where it's outside the stage and goes past my other rectangle. And hence the same, I have the object drawing turned on, so I have my bounding box. I'll immediately select the selection tool. And what I'll do is select this, and using the modify arrange, I'm going to send it to back because it's on that layer, and it will go behind it. So what I've done is I've used two rectangles, one to create like a ground plane, the other one just to create a random backdrop with the horizon line being the stroke. Now I can't see my stage, so that kind of plays a disadvantage. So what I'll do is go to view. I'm going to turn on rulers. And what this allows me to do is I can actually create guides using rulers just like Photoshop. What I can also do here is I can go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and turn off my background layer. Now I'm going to name it background first. And then using the eyeball setting, I'm going to click that little dot there in the layer. I'm going to turn off my visual elements. And then I'm going to use the selection tool. And I'm going to click and drag from the actual rulers over. And it's going to create a guide. I'm going to go ahead and just place my guides where I understand where the outer dimensions of my stage are. I'm going to click and drag another one out. It's going to go to this side. Release, and then I'm going to click and drag from the top and bring it down to the bottom. And I'll click and drag another one. I'll bring it from the top and create the guide for the top part. And release. So I've framed out my stage. So when I go ahead and I click the dot show eyeball tool again for the background, I now understand where my stage dimensions are, but I've created the visual elements and they go outside the dimensions, which is exactly what we want at this point in time. Let's go ahead and lock the background layer so we don't have to manipulate any further by accident. So I will click the lock tool, and then down the bottom I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. After creating a new layer, I'm going to double click, name it ball, and on the ball layer I'm basically going to select a new color. I'm going to do red, and I'm going to select oval. And I'm going to keep the stroke the way it is. I'm going to click and drag outside my stage dimension. I'm going to create this ball, like so. That looks pretty good. That's right in scale. With the object drawing tool activated, that's fine. At this point in time, it doesn't matter if it's going to become a movie clip or an animated element. So at this point in time, we've created our ball object. What we have to do at this point in time, create this object as an animated element. We need to grab the selection tool, make sure it's selected, and immediately go to modify. I'm going to convert it to what's called a symbol. The hotkey is F8. Once it's converted to a symbol, I'm going to name it ball. I'm going to actually have its type called a movie clip. I'm going to make sure its registration point is at the center, because that way that's its anchor point centered. Click OK. And if I go over here to the Properties menu, everything looks pretty good. But if I click on the Library tab, now you'll notice that the animated element has appeared in our library. And the icon's completely different from the last lesson. When we imported an image, it looked like a JPEG. It had a graphic icon. This one actually has a movie wheel, a little motion wheel, to indicate that it is an animated element. So with the ball selected, what we have to do at this point in time is I need to come down into the timeline. I need to actually add the frames across my timeline that we're going to use for this animation. If I just left click and deactivate the ball selection and just with the layer still selected, I'm noticing that there's only 2 frames down here, and they're actually keyframes because we created the visual elements on those frames, which have automatically been converted to keyframes. The difference between a frame and a keyframe has a black dot in the middle of the frame. So you can see this shows that it understands that there are visual elements here as representation, and that these are blank frames. These are just standard frames. Down at the bottom, you have your time controls. And pretty soon I'm going to show you the onion skin, and we'll come back to that to understand how it makes animation user-friendly. But right now we've got to build our timeline. So the way we do that is I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to click and drag starting with the frame ahead of the keyframes. So I'm going to click and drag across my timeline. I'm going to make sure both rows are selected all the way to frame 100. When I release my click, you'll notice that these frames are selected and they're highlighted into a dark yellow. That's great. Right click, now that they're selected, and go on up in the submenu and select Insert Frame. You'll have to right click on one of the selected frames after you made the selection. Go into the submenu and click Insert Frame. Once that's done, you'll notice I can now move my playhead across my timeline. Because I have frames established, I cannot move this playhead past 100. Move it back. We've got our keyframes, we have our animated element, and we have our background. Perfect. Let's select the ball. So if we select the ball, the best tool to use is what we learned in the last lesson, the transform tool. So I'm going to grab the transform tool, and I'm going to actually select frame 10. So I'm going to click on frame 10. Now, if you'd like to just scroll to frame 10 without having to select it, it's your preference. Move my playhead back here. In the time controls, you're just noticing that there's these tools called step forward 1 frame. The other one is, on the other side of the play device, step back 1 frame. So I could easily just left click and tap this 10 times and it will scroll right to frame 10. And then again, you can see right here, if I left click, noticing on frame, I could type in which frame I want it to go to. I could say frame 0. It takes me back to frame 0 for the playhead. Or hence what we're trying to do, left click, I could type in, I want frame 10, hit enter, and now my playhead immediately goes to frame 10. That makes it pretty user friendly. I'm going to left click on frame 10 for the ball, and the way we need to make it animate is we have to actually first establish all the positioning keyframes where the ball is going to be throughout the animation. Once it's selected, I will right click and I'm going to go to insert keyframe. This will create a new keyframe at that location. Once it's created, using the transform tool while it's still activated, I don't want to wait until my pointer actually moves up too far where it turns into the transform property. We don't want to do this. Using the transform tool, make sure your pointer is somewhere in the middle of your ball object, but does not hover over the anchor point being at the center, because I can easily move that registration point, which is not what we want to do either. So make sure you're in a good distance inside your ball, which is between your registration point and the outer dimension of this transform box, so none of the other property controls come up that make it transform or move your registration point. Make sure your pointer looks like this with the move tool. Click, drag, and select frame 10, right click on frame 10, select insert keyframe. You must insert your keyframe first and then you move the ball. I'm going to bring my ball down. I'm going to drop it somewhere along the ground plane. Now another thing we need to do is we need to actually create another guide that allows us to actually keep this ball bouncing in a straight line as it goes across the floor. So I'm going to create another guide. I'm going to use the selection tool, and then I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to bring another guide out of my ruler. I'm going to make sure this guide aligns directly with the bottom of that bounding box of the ball. So when I activate the transform tool again, notice at the bottom of that transform box aligns with the guide. This is good. I'm going to move my playhead 3 frames forward. So I'm going to use the step forward 1 frame. I'm going to click it 3 times, which would be frame 13. At frame 13, I will select frame 13. Make sure it's selected individually. Right click, insert keyframe. We have to establish the keyframe first, and then we have to modify the property of the object. So the keyframe's been established. Now I can indicate what I want it to look like at that keyframe. I will squish this ball because weight on a ball distributes and squishes. Once I make that adjustment, I'll use the arrow keys on my keyboard to make sure that the bottom of that bounding box aligns with the guide. I'm going to go 2 more frames forward. I will select frame 15, have it selected, right-click on it, and then insert keyframe again. Once that's established, I can then again use the transform tool. I'm going to squish it back the other direction, then use the arrow keys on my keyboard to tap it up and make sure the bottom of that bounding box is aligned with that guide. What do we have so far? Let's just move the playhead back and see what's going on here. Okay, so animation works like this. We've got to establish our keyframes first before we can actually set up the animated tween. So all our keyframes are setting up what that ball looks like at that specific time. This is looking really good. I'm going to move my playhead to frame 20. I'm going to select frame 20. Make sure only frame 20 is selected. Right click, insert keyframe. And now I'm going to move my ball up because once a ball comes down, lands, squishes, distributes its weight, it's going to distribute back up and then eventually comes back up into position into somewhere within the air. But it does not come up the same height as it did when it started. So I'm going to move my ball up roughly probably right about here. Once the ball is positioned there at frame 20, perfect. There's a really neat menu in Flash. It's called the transform menu. I can left click. It's right over here in the interface. If you can't find it, just go to Window, turn it on here. Control T is the hotkey. And then you're noticing that the scale width and the scale height have unlike dimensions. I'm going to just click and change this to 100 using my keyboard. Hit enter, lock it in. I'll do the same for the other one. And now we're back to proper proportion on our ball at that keyframe. Move my playhead back. Notice that the range of the ball is working to our advantage. Okay, at this point in time, like the example that I've shown you, we want to add a highlight so we can understand proper rotation of this ball. This is the animated keyframing process for this ball so it animates correctly throughout the scene. I'm going to move my playhead back to frame 1 or keyframe 1, and with this ball selected, I'm going to grab the selectional tool. I'm going to double click it. So by double clicking this object now, you're going to notice what happens. The whole scene turns gray, and that's okay. Because inside, what we're noticing is that we're inside what's called the movie clip, which is what was converted from conversion into a symbol, and that movie clip is also located in the library. If I double click it again, now you're noticing that drawing object appears. What that allows us to do is it allows us to manipulate this object further. So like the previous lesson when we were creating object drawing, it's okay, but at any time, any drawn object, even though it has object drawing turned on, I could double click it and still get in there and modify it. What I want to do here is have it deselected. So click outside it, click on the oval tool, change the fill color to white, go to stroke, say no on the stroke, and just go to left click and drag and create a highlight. When that's selected, you notice I had object drawing turned on. I'll have the selectional tool activated. I'll select that object, go to modify, break it apart, click outside to deselect, then hover my selection tool over the edge until it turns that little curve icon next to the pointer. Click and drag. I can deform that shape. I can then select it, click and drag, and move it onto my ball. If it's too big, use the transform tool with it selected and skew it down. Then go back to your selection tool, select it, click, drag, and drop it on the ball. Nice. So right now we're in the drawing object. If I want to get back to my scene, I could do one or two things. I could click ball, which that gets me back into the movie clip. But in order to get back to my scene, I would left click scene 1 and I'm back into my scene. If I have the ball selected, I can move my playhead forward here. It's coming up. I'm going to go to frame 25. select frame 25 so it's highlighted, right click, go to insert keyframe, grab the transform tool, move it down, move it forward, and make sure the bounding box, using the arrow keys on my keyboard, lines with that guide. Now something I can do at this point in time is actually see what's going on with this range of motion, and that's called the onion skin. So I could turn that on right down here. If you're noticing, there's this little property called onion skin. It's down here at the bottom of the interface. I'm going to left click and select that. And this allows me to see the actual range of motion throughout the process of this bouncing ball that we're creating here. It's basically bringing up a ghost-like feature of all the keyframes that we've keyframed prior in the range of the process. I'm going to go back to frame 20. Now, something we have to do is the highlight's coming up, it's rotating forward. I'm going to go to frame 20, and I've got to make sure that this highlight's still going forward. So with the transform tool, I'm going to just hover over the corner. It's going to be rotate until it turns that little rotate tool. Hold shift, left click and drag until that highlight shows forward. Move my playhead back. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. All right, moving forward, I'm going to use the time control down here, step forward one frame. I'm going to click that 1, 2, 3. It's frame 28. I will select frame 28, right click, insert keyframe, and now we've got to squash it. So I'm going to squash my ball, showing weight distribution. I'm going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard. I'm going to move it down to the bounding box lines of the guide. I'm going to move it forward 2 more using that step forward 1 frame. I'm going to go to frame 30, select frame 30, right click, insert the keyframe first, and then make the adjustment. Adjust my ball, stretch the other direction, use the arrow keys on my keyboard. Back to the guide. Perfect. It's going to move up. We go to frame 35. I'm going to select frame 35, right click, insert keyframe, and I'm going to move my ball up. I'm going to make sure that this ball is not going as high as it did before, but it's kind of coming up, and that way it shows that nice gravity working throughout that range of motion. I'm going to move it to where it needs to be. I'm going to go to my transform menu. I'm going to change its property value to 100 by 100. Perfect. All right, move 5 frames forward. Frame 40, select frame 40 only. Right click, insert keyframe, bring it down, make sure the bottom of the transform box is aligned with that guide using arrow keys on the keyboard, positioning where it needs to be. We're going to go back to frame 35, select it, and with the transform tool still activated, use the rotational value, move your pointer over one of the corners, click and drag to rotate it. Hold shift, make sure the highlight faces down at frame 35. Select keyframe 40. Again, same process. It's not going to only face down, but it's got to face the opposite direction. Make it look like it's rotating. Move our playhead back. This is looking good. All right. It's on the ground, so we go 3 frames forward to make it look like it's squishing. 1, 2, 3. That would be frame 43. Select frame 43. Right click. Insert keyframe. Use the transform tool to squish it down. Use the arrow keys on the keyboard to make sure it lines with the guide. Go 2 more frames forward. That's frame 45. Select frame 45. Right click. Insert keyframe. Stretch it up. Use the arrow keys on your keyboard. Position where it needs to be. Frame 50. 5 frames forward. It's going to come back up. Select frame 50. Right click. Insert keyframe. Bring it up. Not as high as the last time, using that onion skin. So we've got 1, 2, 3. This would be 4, and then we got 1 more at the end. Perfect. At frame 50, we go to the transform menu. Make it 100% a piece. It's got to come down, so frame 55. 5 more forward. Select frame 55, right click, insert keyframe. Bring it down. Use the arrow keys, make sure that bounding box aligns with the guide. Back to frame 50 and use the rotational property. Hold shift, make sure the highlight's facing up. Frame 55. highlight needs to be facing that direction. Forward. Yep, need to be facing forward. This is looking good. Last one. It's at frame 55. It's touched the ground, so we go 3 frames forward. 1, 2, 3. That's frame 58. I select frame 58. I right-click, insert keyframe, squash this down. Use your arrow keys on your keyboard. Make sure the bottom of that box lines with the guide. Go 2 more forward. Frame 60. Select frame 60. Right-click, insert keyframe. Stretch it back up. Use the arrow keys on the keyboard, move it up. Go to frame 65. Select frame 65, right click, insert keyframe, move it up. It's the last little bounce. At frame 65, transform menu, 100%. Perfect. Five more forward, 70. Select frame 70, right click, insert keyframe, bring it back down. Perfect. At frame 65, we go back. We got to make sure this thing rotates down. Using that rotational value, and at frame 70, the highlight's not only got to look down, it's got to face the opposite direction. And that is a 5 bounce process. 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is 5. Yep. So we go one more. This thing's going to actually bounce out of frame. So I go 3 frames forward. 1, 2, 3. Select that frame. Right click. Insert keyframe. Squishes. Arrow keys. 2 more forward. 75. Select 75. Right click. Insert keyframe. Stretches up. Arrow keys on your keyboard. Make sure the bounding box aligns with the guide. Frame 80. Select frame 80. Right click. Insert keyframe. Move it outside your scene. Use the transform property to make it 100%. And we're good to go. Make sure it also does not, well, I might want to make it kind of still inside the frame here. Right about here. Frame 85, we'll actually make it, I'll select frame 85, insert, keyframe, and then bring it out. We got one more little tiny bounce there. Let's go back to 80. Use the transform, rotate the highlight up. 85. Only going up, it's going forward. Perfect. And there's our 5 bounces. All right. That's that. Now, if you ever need to increase the amount of length of your stage, if you notice, I have a little bit extra space that I've created here. It's very easy. At any time, you can lock your ball layer, unlock your background layer, and use your what's called your sub-selectional tool. Again, left-click on any of your shapes to activate them with the sub-selection. Then select one of the top points, hold Shift, select the bottom point, release Shift from the keyboard, and then click and drag and just stretch this out further and make your adjustment. And then the same applies for this shape down here. You can select it, hold Shift, select those points, stretch it. I can turn off my background layer to see where my stage is. Let's say this is where my stage would end. First, click outside the white box, which is your stage in the dark gray area, and then go to stage properties. Right now my stage width is 800, so I want it to be 850. There we go, 850. Okay. And then turn all the elements back on, lock the layer, and now you have that additional space to work with. Perfect. And that's how you can increase your space of your scene very easily, making those modifications anytime. If you have an extra frame at the end, I'm going to turn off my onion skin here. If you have an extra frame at the end, which I do, just select it, or any range of frames that you really don't need. Like let's say from frame 101 all the way to 90. I don't really need these anymore because I've completed the animation 85. I can just click, drag across them, select all frames for both layers, right click, and then go to remove frames. All right. And you got your ball bouncing range of motion. Another thing you can do, which is a little tricky, you can click, drag across any of these range of keyframes, and you have to start on the one you know you want to move. Click and drag, start on that one, and then go across, like let's say to like 50. And let's say this is where that ball is actually coming back up into the air. If you want to make the ball bounce faster, what you do is bring these keyframes close together. So I could say from like 85 to like 50, if I wanted the ball to move faster, I could select that range and then click and drag and move them all in union. And now that ball is going a lot faster, say in the ball bouncing motion. So you have the ability to do that across any of your keyframes. Or go back and kind of tweak some of the squash and stretch if you want. In order to see the full effect of this, the range of motion, we have to add what's called the classic tween. So the very last thing you would do, once you get the number of frames you need in keyframes, just click and drag across your entire frame range, and you would start at the very end. So you start on this point, click and drag from there all the way to forward, and select all your keyframes, all your frames across that layer for the ball, right click, and then in the submenu you're going to select Create Classic Tween. And once that's done, basically what that means is in between. So all frames in between those keyframes are now animated, and it has the nice flow and range of motion, and the bounces in there, and it looks pretty good. Okay? For publishing, it's real easy. You simply go to File for a project submission. You go to File, Publish Settings, and inside this menu, click the folder, indicate where you want to save it to. You would name your file accordingly. You don't need the HTML wrapper. You can turn that off, but the most important part is make sure your JPEG quality is 100. And then you click Publish. Click OK. And once that is all done, you go out to the folder, find your file, open it up, and then you can play it back. And this is what you call the SWF file. This is the file that you would want to submit. It's right here. This is the file that you're going to want to turn in. If you right click on it to get more information, you can go to Properties, or on a Mac you can go to Get Info, and you can open up and you can see that it is an SWF animated file. It's Adobe Flash Player that plays back the file type. And that's the file that you're going to want to submit. Keep in mind that you can go to my LinkedIn page at linkedin.com if you would like to link up with me and have me as a resource and a reference in your list of contacts. You can send me a message at my LinkedIn, and that will reach out to my Yahoo email, hence my Gmail accounts, and I can always be there to help you. Thank you for watching, and look forward to working with you.